Hi and welcome back to the Anglian Learning Trust GDPR training. This is the last chapter for now. Consent, how, why and when. So for a change, here's a quick definition. Consent represents one way of legally processing personal data. It is one of the several legal bases. Remember, consent is not always the recommended basis for processing personal data. So where possible, try to avoid using consent and use the other legal grounds, such as legitimate interest. And we'll come on to that. Consent has to be clear, intelligible, transparent and freely given. And remember, consent should be as easy to remove as it was given. And here's a real kicker for a lot of places. Consent can no longer be assumed. It's important to remember there is a legal obligation for children to be educated. Therefore, consent is not required to process students' personal data. However, this may not apply to special categories of personal data. When consent is needed, you should be able to demonstrate that the data subject has given you consent. Yes, over to you, Sonny.
So can I get consent orally?
You can. And obviously that's a little bit tricky because you do have to prove that consent was given. So my advice to you is log it down. But remember, that person can remove the consent whenever they decide, and you have to be able to reflect that in what you do.
Thank you.
So, soft opt-in, an old-fashioned one this, it isn't acceptable anymore. Children can give consent, but only in certain situations. For information services, over 13s can consent to his or her PII being processed. This may be on train Wi-Fi when they're going to see grandma. The ICO has provided guidance on when a child over 13 can give consent, and some of that is the child must clearly understand the ramifications of the consent and that there must be no suspicion of coercion. Parental consent is required when you can't demonstrate those, and remember there are other things as well, but we can come on to that later on. So here's some alternatives to consent. Legitimate interest, which we talked about briefly before. These are things like extensions of the school's activities, fundraising, we're going to have a market stall, things like that, sending letters out to parents and emails and all that stuff, that could come under legitimate interest. Lawful obligation, supplying student examination papers to the examining bodies. Vital interest, protecting students' health. Yes, Sonny, go ahead.
What do we mean by vital interest?
So if you know Billy, who's just collapsed into the playground, is allergic to penicillin, and you get medics on scene with an ambulance, etc., it may be important to let them know they can't administer penicillin. Okay, thank you for that question. Public interest, the COVID-19 data sharing with the UK government. We're all aware of track and trace and how that worked. Well, that actually was processing several categories of personal data. You remember the question about location data. Well, that's one of the reasons it works. It knows where you are, and therefore when Bob turns out he had COVID, it knows you were near to him. And it also shares other data, like things like MAC addresses, which we touched on, and indeed phone numbers. So quite a lot of data sharing going on. And the last one is contract. So that's the provision of service or services with a defined goal that is legally binding. E.g. the provision of music classes out of school. And lots of out of school activities happen. So thanks for listening everybody, and I'll see you in the next lot of modules.